Hey, deep dive listeners. Ever find yourself wondering about that hazy next day feeling after using cannabis? Like, is it a real thing or just all in our heads?
No.
Well, today we're diving right into those next day effects of cannabis use.
Okay.
And we've got some fascinating new research from cannabis and cannabinoid research to guide us.
Right.
So we always hear about this cannabis hangover. What's the reality check?
Well, it's a question that comes up a lot, especially when you think about things like driving or work. We're
Yeah.
talking about millions of people using cannabis, so those next day effects, they really matter.
Absolutely. It's a big deal. And this research we're looking at, it's a systematic review, right?
Exactly.
Can you explain to our listeners why that type of research is so important?
Sure. A systematic review, it's like the all-star team of research. It gathers up all the relevant studies on a specific question.
Okay.
And then it analyzes how good those studies are, how rigorous they were, and then it puts it all together to give us a much clearer picture.
So it's like the Avengers of research, here to assemble and give us the real deal.
Yeah, you could say that.
So this super study we've got, what exactly did it look at when it comes to cannabis?
This one zeroed in on how THC, the main player in cannabis that gets you high,
Right.
how THC affects us the day after we use it. So we're talking more than 8 hours later.
Okay.
And they looked at things like, how's our driving? Can we still focus at work? Do we remember where we parked the car? Things like that.
Everyday stuff that matters.
Exactly. And they analyzed a huge amount of data, 345 tests from 20 different studies.
Whoa, 145 tests. They were serious about getting to the bottom of this. So with all that data, what'd they find?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Most of the studies, they found no negative next-day effects from THC.
Wait, seriously? That seems kind of shocking, to be honest. I mean, we've always heard the opposite.
Yeah, it is surprising, but hold on, we need to dig a little deeper.
Okay, what kind of details are we talking about?
Well, one thing is that the older studies, especially those before the 2000s, they were more likely to find those negative next-day effects.
Interesting.
The problem is, a lot of those older studies weren't as strict in their methods, They didn't always control for other things that could be affecting the results.
Give us an example. What kind of things could throw off those findings?
So imagine a study where they don't account for whether someone had a beer the night before testing.
Right.
That alcohol could easily impact how THC affects them the next day, making it seem like the THC is the culprit when it's really the combination.
Ah, so it's like blaming your roommate for the mess when you forgot you had friends over the night before.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Got to be sure we're isolating the right culprit. So how can we tell which studies to really trust?
That's where these two newer studies come in, one by Matheson in 2020 and another by Brands in 2019. These were really well designed with strict controls, and they used a decent dose of THC, so we know people were actually feeling it. They're what we call the gold standard of research.
Okay, so like the Beyonce and Jay-Z of THC studies, top-notch. But remind us again why this really meticulous study design is so crucial.
Imagine you're trying to bake a cake. You wouldn't use expired milk and swap out the sugar for salt and then blame the oven when it comes out a disaster, right?
Definitely not if I want a cake I can actually eat.
Exactly. It's the same with these studies. The stricter the design, the more confident we can be that any effects they're seeing are actually due to the THC and not some other ingredient in the mix, so to speak.
Makes sense. So these top-tier studies, the Beyonce and Jay-Z of the research world, what did they find about those next-day effects?
Well, they found no next-day impairment
At all?
on things like driving, memory, attention,
Wow.
all those everyday tasks we need to do.
So even after a full night's sleep, no brain fog. That's pretty wild, because we've all heard the opposite for so long.
It is surprising, right? And get this, they even checked after 48 hours.
2 days later, and still firing on all cylinders. Okay, now I'm really starting to question everything I thought I knew. So if these really high-quality studies are saying that THC doesn't have these lingering effects, should we be rethinking all those strict rules about cannabis use? Especially in the workplace, I'm thinking.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And It's definitely not a simple one.
Right.
Even though this research is really promising, we still need way more, especially when it comes to edibles.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because the way our bodies absorb THC from edibles is so different from smoking, right? So we can't just assume the effects are going to be the same.
That makes total sense. I mean, edibles definitely hit differently.
They do. But here's something else to consider. This review, they also looked at alcohol hangovers. And that research pretty consistently shows that hangovers do mess with those same skills.
Like what specifically?
Driving, memory, attention, all those things. Yet for some reason, society seems like way more okay with those next day effects if they're from alcohol.
That's so true. Nobody even blinks if someone's a little slow the morning after a few beers, but use cannabis, and suddenly everyone's freaking out.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder, how we decide which substances are acceptable and which ones aren't, especially when the science might be telling us a totally different story.
It's a total paradox, isn't it? Like, what's going on here? And
Yeah.
it just highlights how important it is to make sure our policies, our perspectives, they're actually based on solid scientific evidence,
Absolutely. So, okay, we busted some myths today, it seems,
Yeah,
but we're also left with, like, a lot to think about.
definitely.
What would you say are the big takeaways our listeners should remember about this whole next day cannabis thing?
Well, I think the biggest one is nuance.
Okay.
It's just not as black and white as, a lot of people think it is. There's still a ton we don't know, especially when it comes to people who use cannabis every day, which these studies didn't really focus on.
That makes sense. Everyone's different, and like
Mhm.
you said, how much you use, how often, all of that probably plays a role.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about those practice effects you mentioned earlier? How do those fit into all of this?
Yeah. So that's another layer of complexity.
Okay.
Practice effects basically mean that when you do the same test over and over,
Uh-huh.
you naturally get better at it, even if you're still a bit impaired.
So someone in a study might seem less affected by the THC on like day 2 or day 3, not because their body's processing it differently,
Exactly.
but because they've just gotten used to the test itself.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Wow.
And that's another reason why researchers really need to be on top of their game when they're designing these studies.
Right.
They've got to find ways to account for these practice effects.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Uh,
The research methods always have to be evolving as our understanding of cannabis evolves too.
Precisely.
So, okay, let's say someone's listening to this and they're thinking about using cannabis, but they have a job or something where they really need to be on point the next day.
Right.
What's your advice to them? What's the most responsible approach?
It really comes down to knowledge is power,
Yeah.
Making those informed decisions, that's what matters.
Right.
Until we have even more research to go on, I'd say it's wise to err on the side of caution,
Yeah.
especially if you've got a job or something important the next day where you really need to be on top of your game.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's your responsibility to understand how cannabis affects you personally
Exactly.
and to make those choices that put your safety and well-being first.
Exactly. And keep in mind, everybody's different, right?
Yeah.
How your body handles cannabis, it's like, well, it depends on so many things, your metabolism, how much you use normally, even what you ate that day, or how stressed you are. It's all connected.
So many factors. It's not as easy as just like checking the clock and saying, okay, I'm good to go.
Not at all. And, we've been focusing on THC this whole time, but let's not forget about all the other compounds in cannabis.
Right. Like CBD.
Exactly. CBD, all the others, they could have completely different effects. We just don't know enough yet.
It's true. There's still so much to uncover, which I guess is what makes this whole field so fascinating, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like we're just scratching the surface when it comes to understanding this plant, how it interacts with our bodies and minds.
I completely agree.
Well, deep dive listeners, we've certainly given you a lot to digest today about the next day effects of cannabis.
We have.
The science is, well, it's complicated and it's definitely still evolving, but one thing's for sure, staying informed, that's key.
Couldn't agree more.
So arm yourselves with knowledge, make the choices that feel right for you, and as always, thanks for diving deep with us.